This is the Gold Newsletter Podcast, your home for investment, economics, and geopolitics. For our publications and archives, go to goldnewsletter.com. Welcome to the Gold Newsletter Podcast. This is your host, Fergus Hodgson. I have today with me Brian London in New Orleans, and we have two special guests of peak prosperity. They are Chris Martenson, both are highly educated. He has a PhD from Duke University and an MBA from Cornell, economic researcher and futurist, specializing in energy and resource depletion. He was one of the early economics bloggers who forecasted the housing market collapse. When did you forecast that, Chris?
I started writing in earnest in 2006 and 2007.
Great. Okay, so right in the lead up. And Adam Taggart is an experienced Silicon Valley internet executive with an MBA from Stanford. Prior to partnering with Chris, he was a vice president at Yahoo, and before that, he was a startup entrepreneur. As a fresh-faced graduate from Brown University in the early 1990s, Adam got a first-hand look at all that was broken with Wall Street as an investment banking analyst for Merrill Lynch. So, welcome to the show. What a privilege to have you on.
Well, thank you.
It's very nice to be here, Fergus. Thank you.
Great. And yeah, so we were just reviewing a few of your latest headlines from your website. The one that struck my greatest attention was, "This is an inherently dangerous moment in history." Adam, do you want to take that one? Why is it more dangerous than past eras?
Sure, I'll take that, and I'll hand the football to Chris, because you're right, I did write the article, but the article was actually of a podcast that Chris did with Richard Silla.
Gotcha.
Richard Silla is a Princeton-educated economist. He's in many ways kind of the epitome of your Ivy League, ivory tower economist. But he works or spent many of his years at the Stern School of Business in New York, and his focus there was interest rates. And about 15 years ago or so, he co-authored a book that's since been updated that takes a historic sweep at how interest rates have operated over the millennia. He literally looks at something like 5,000 years of interest rates. It's an unbelievable amount of data, a huge sweep of history. And he cuts to the chase, basically, in this interview, saying, in case it was not completely crystal clear to everybody, we are living at the period of the lowest interest rates in recorded human history. So thousands of years of data, ever since the time of Hammurabi back in Babylonia. Interest rates have never been as prevalently and historically low around the world as they are right now. So we are literally living in uncharted territory. Of course, that discussion then opens the box of, okay, so why is that important? Why is it something we should talk about? And the discussion that ensues from there between Chris and Richard are all about the pricing misallocations that happen when you monkey around with interest rates, and when you depress them. Very often you create asset price bubbles. This was also a topic that Chris and Brian...
An immediate question that comes to mind is that there's got to be some reason why interest rates can be held so low for so long. I don't think there's any dispute about the fact that they are historically low. The question is that given a demand for money, you would assume that a very low interest rate would create enormous borrowing, and it would have a huge inflationary impact. Now, I know that it depends on how you calculate inflation or measure it, and yes, there's been inflation maybe in the stock market in certain sectors, but the general price level in the United States, at least, has not grown at markedly high rates that would cause alarm. Why has that not happened?
Well, I think you've mentioned it a bit there, which is if we want to talk about the things that people depend on for living, those things have seen market increases over, certainly in my lifetime. If we're talking about food, energy, healthcare, or education, those have all skyrocketed. Certainly, if you look at the assets that the wealthy own, if we're talking about Gulfstream jets or fine art or trophy properties, all of those have basically been off to the races as well during this most recent spate of interest rate suppression. So I think in many, many ways, we are seeing what we would expect to see happen there. Now, the government's official inflation numbers are very moderate, as you've mentioned. We have a lot of information, both in the articles we've written about at the site and in videos in our Crash Course video series that we delve into what we call the fuzzy numbers that are published by the government, which in many cases are gross distortions of what actually is happening in reality out there in the world. But as you know, so many elements are priced off of the inflation rate. Of course, this huge pile of debt that we're talking about as well. One of the reasons why interest rates at this point really have to be suppressed is the cost of servicing the immense amount of debt that we've blown over the past 50 plus years. If we were to let interest rates rise to sort of a market equilibrium, it would have devastating effects for the economy, and the government and corporate America just wouldn't be able to service those debts. So in many cases, this is not done for nefarious reasons. It's being done because the government is petrified of what would happen if it let rates rise.
We could do a whole podcast on just what Adam was just talking about. I mean, the way the government records the CPI, they use hedonic deflators and other gimmicks to reduce the reported rate of inflation, and all under the guise of the excuse that it makes it more accurate. But if you were a lowly bureaucrat or analyst in the Bureau of Labor Statistics and you came up with or realized that there was some inaccuracy in the CPI and that you could correct it and suggested a correction that would actually report higher inflation rates than what had been reported, do you think you'd really have much of a career from that point forward?
Well, Brian, we've got one example we ran on our site recently that I think people will be able to really relate to, which is that, one of the things they do is hedonic adjustments. And so it means things are getting better. And I won't argue that cars have gotten better over time. But if you look at what the BLS says, they say, hey, cars actually have deflated every year since 1997. Right. They're cheaper than 1997. But if you went back and looked at the prices of them, they're up 100% in terms of what you actually have to pay for them. So your experience is cars are now $33,000. They used to be $17,000, but the government tells you, oh, actually they're cheaper today than before. So whatever's being measured is not measuring the cost of living. We just have to get that out of the way.
That's exactly right. That what they should be measuring is what is the price of the median automobile, and how is that going up, regardless of quality of improvements, et cetera. And and they'll argue that that email and computers have become, and social media made people become so much more productive. Well, there's an argument that the exact opposite has been the case.
Yeah.
But so there's a lot to talk about there. But what we were talking about earlier, in that, why haven't we had higher inflation reported? Well, we have, in financial assets due to this great wave of money. And I mentioned that to you in our podcast the other day on your site, Chris, that the correlation between the Fed's asset base, the rise in the Fed's asset base since 2008, and the rise in the S&P 500, the correlation is 97%. So we know where that money went into. It went into financial assets and the lifestyle items of the rich and famous. And that's where they've been kind of locked in. But amazingly and interestingly, it seems that all of this money, this easy money, both in terms of low interest rates and money printing, has actually been deflationary because it's created malinvestment and excess capacity. So that's something that I don't think anybody's ever seen before, but that's not surprising because, as Adam just mentioned, we haven't seen interest rates this low in recorded history. This is truly uncharted territory.
Well, it absolutely is, and one of the points that Richard Silla made, the professor in that podcast, was he knew Hyman Minsky personally. And of course, Hyman Minsky would take a moment like this and say, stability breeds instability. So we look at our markets today, they're just flooded with liquidity. The VIX, the measure of volatility, is all-time lows. Everybody's thinking this is just going to keep going. It's some kind of new normal. But history says, no, you never have a new normal. What you have is mispriced money. We've run it down to zero. So the cost of capital, there's no discounting mechanism. So we don't, like the rate of interest, Richard Silla was telling us, is telling you something about the future. So you have to discount that money back to the present, We're not doing that. So of course, like, how do you possibly put a fair price on something if the cost of capital is zero? It doesn't. Everything that we know about economic history, and we have 5,000 years of it, this has never been tried before. And that's at least something I wish people were aware of and they were talking about, which is, hey, this isn't just like a slight departure. They're not trying something just a little new. We're trying something that has never been tried in 5,000 years before. And Hyman Minsky might say, well, the law of unintended consequences has a say usually in these things, and that you should expect a big bout of volatility, which is a polite way of saying hair-raising market crashes with bloods in the street and all that.
Does it have to end that way? Because I see the Japanese example of the lost decade or lost 2 decades now, where they've gone to great lengths to expand the money supply, and it really has just been a long-term recession. There hasn't really been anything explosive. Does it have to come to an explosive end?
It doesn't have to, but it probably will because of the giant mismatch. So let's back way up and let's understand that money is not a real thing. It's a claim on something. We use money because it's a claim on wealth. So we always have to understand there should be a balance between money and stuff. So the things we want to buy with it. And of course, debt is just a claim on future money. So that puts a time element into that. But when you're accumulating mass piles of debt and money, let's be honest, we're just accumulating claims on the future and future stuff. So if we wander back to Japan, the world's largest floating retirement colony, losing population, what is remaining is aging rapidly. They actually need a deflating economy in the sense of one that's becoming smaller. But instead, because our financial system requires credit to always grow, they're just panicking and they're just ramming up the amount of debt per capita. And it's now per household a little over $1 million of debt per household. And people go, well, it doesn't matter. They owe it to themselves. That would only be true if everybody held the debt equally. They don't. And so what they've sacrificed there, Fergus, is they sacrificed an entire generation. The social statistics about young people, marriage, household formation, childbearing, all there's really what they've done is they've preserved a zombie financial system at the expense of the entire generation that was meant to come along and add viability to the future. So it's really, really dangerous stuff. We don't just fiddle around with money and interest rates. It's a social experiment because money is a social contract. And when one small group of bankers abrogates contract unilaterally, I think that, the chance of it ending explosively is actually quite high under those circumstances.
It really doesn't have to end explosively, but it can progress quite dramatically in that when you have these levels of debt, you have to have a corresponding depreciation in the values of the underlying currencies. Otherwise, the debts are completely unmanageable. And what we've seen in Japan is that, yes, it's depreciated. It did for a while against other world currencies, but it doesn't appear to recently because all of the world currencies are trying to get to the bottom of the hill ahead of the others. We have these competitive devaluations going on because every developed nation has joined the debt club and has created these monstrous levels of debt. So they're all depreciating against each other. And what that means is that you want to have an individual crisis in one economy, but you'll have either a steady, if not quick, depreciation of these currencies against gold and tangible assets, or at some point, a very quick and very dramatic depreciation or devaluation of these currencies. Whichever way it goes, it really argues for the fact that people just need to be prepared, and they need to hold gold, silver, and tangible items that are going to appreciate.
Very well said, Brian. We couldn't agree more.
Let's assume that that this unprecedented era of low interest or low cost fiat currency will come to an end with some turmoil. Are there catalyzing events that might alert people that the process is beginning?
Well, certainly. There's lots of things that need tracking, and our view is that this is a little bit like asking which snowflake is going to be the final one to bring the cornice off of the ridgeline down and bring an avalanche into the valley. We know the pressures are building. So what we do, the financial systems and markets are inherently chaotic systems. And so what we know about chaos theory and chaos systems is you can't predict exactly what's going to happen or how big it's going to be, exactly when or how big. You can't do those two things, but you can start to record the risk factors. And so when we look at the things that made 2008 happen, you know, people like to say, oh, it was that moment Lehman did this, or it was that Bear Stearns that, you know, those are the things we sort of attach after the fact. But the truth was those would have been meaningless if there hadn't been these enormous risk factors built up. So Adam and I, we track these things and we say, well, here are some risk factors when your debt levels get too high, when risk gets when you think you've managed to put risk off to the side, but you haven't, right? That was the whole fiasco with derivatives. They thought they'd contained risk. People thought they bought these CDOs that protected them against, downside in their structured portfolios of mortgage-backed securities, all that stuff. So when we're looking at this, we note that like the debt levels are just extraordinarily, both at the sovereign level, at the household level, new records now. Certainly depending on which location you look at, Canada off the charts, you know, historically speaking, Australia, same thing. US hitting new records in terms of nominal amounts of debt, the corporate debt, everything. So all the debts are there. We still have a big derivative pile, and we still have a lot of people convinced that somehow the central banks are going to be able to control all of this, which we think is a badly misplaced faith. And they're just people, right? Not that many of them. And they're all academics practically. So we look at all that, and we can't know exactly what's going to happen or when, but we do note that the risk factors are now really, really high. Things in the market, we talk about broken markets is really this idea that computers dominate the whole thing. We just saw Andy Hall, the god of oil trading, come out of it basically saying, I can't fight these machines anymore. So the machines own the market. But when the machines decide they're going to go away, flash crash, flash crash, flash crash, we've had 4 giant ones and innumerable small ones. And so our view is the market is only primed to grow. Anything that will prevent it from growing at some point, and you will see this very rapid evaporation of the trading practices by these algorithms. This is, we're fond of saying, this ain't your daddy's market. Totally different beast. Hey, it might be more stable than we think, but we note the risk factors and we say we don't really know how this is going to play out, and people should be prepared for that.
I think this brings up, Fergus, what really strikes at the heart of what Chris and Adam do. If you're looking for something to tell you that the time is nigh, then that's not really what they do. Their whole point, and you guys correct me if I steer off course here, but your whole point is that you really can't predict, but there are enough things out there, there are enough trends that seem to be converging, that there's a very good chance that there will be some crises, some very unsettling events down the road. So you need to prepare now, and especially prepare in ways that increase or in value, increase your lifestyle in the meantime, so that you're going to enjoy the pursuits that also help get you ready for just about anything.
I think that's well said, Brian. I'd maybe make a slight correction there where you're absolutely right that that's our fundamental message. And I think we'll probably transition to talking about that quickly. But we actually do spend a fair amount of time looking at the indicators, whereas Chris said, nobody can say with certainty exactly when and exactly how this is going to manifest. But we spend a lot of our time looking at the indicators that we think give us insight into the probabilities. And as those probabilities shift, that's what we report on sort of a day-to-day basis at peakprosperity.com. So, as Chris was talking earlier, kind of about our general philosophy, and a key element of it is that we think weakness happens from the outside in. So it's the weaker players in the system that are most likely to fail first. And so back in 2007, that was the subprime market. Sovereign-wise, it was countries like Greece. We're always looking at the periphery because we think that's where the early warning signs are going to come from. From the low-grade bonds, from the lower quality borrowers in the auto and home space and whatnot. So we are actually looking at indicators like that. To the spirit of Fergus's question, to give people a sense of where we might be in the timeline here. But that said, to your point, Brian, we do think that what we have confidence in predicting is the outcome here. While the actual path is much harder to divine, the destination is not. And we recommend that people position themselves early. As Chris likes to say, it's in the scenario, it is infinitely better to be a year or two early than a day late. And we advise that people make investments, not just with their financial capital, but with all other elements of their life, and invest those in things that will position them to be much less vulnerable to these risks if they manifest or should they manifest. But as you mentioned, in the interim, they're quality of life enhancers. And hopefully we can talk about that in more detail. But these are investments that, if we're right, are going to take a real outsized value in your life. But if we're completely wrong and the rest of our lives look very much like they have up to date, these are not investments you're ever going to look back and regret. You're never going to regret investing in your health. You're never going to regret investing and becoming more valued in your community. These are things that are just, like I said, life enhancing, but they have a very high option value if some of this turmoil that we're talking about actually manifests.
I'm looking at your article here, Signs of Distress, and the subtitle, this is from Chris, is "The need to change is becoming more obvious than ever." In reading it, you refer both to personal actions and to, you could say, macro or government policies. Why don't you get to that point then you're referring to about actual on-the-ground or personal actions we can take aware of this debt crisis, which is just waiting to unravel?
Sure. I'd love to. One of the things that I think sets us apart a little bit at Peak Prosperity is we're always looking at a very large, big picture. So we do look at the economy, but we don't try and understand it outside of the context of the environment or ecology, and we also understand energy. And we put all three of those E's together. We say, God, yeah, we have to look across all three. And the fact that we can't predict what's going to happen when, for us, is not a deterrent to becoming more prepared. It's actually an accelerant. Because, heck, we don't know, could be tonight, could be 10 years, we don't know. There's some really powerful ecological signs out there looking at species loss, really hard stuff for me, as somebody who grew up as an avid outdoors person, fisherman, all that stuff, I'm really connected to nature. I love it. And I've seen in my own life this huge just sort of reduction in it. And we're seeing signs of collapsing ecosystems all over the place. And we think, God, you can't ignore that. So just to focus in on your question, using that as an example, if you have the opportunity, and not everybody does, but for those who have any access to a yard or maybe more space like that, both Adam and myself, the actions we've taken is we've got gardens, and we're building up soil because we don't grow plants. We actually, grow soil instead. Planting fruit trees for the longer term. Adam and I have different types of animals. I've got chickens. He usually does pigs and chickens every year. All as suburban people. I mean, if you drove by our houses, you would not see this from the road. You'd say, that's another suburban Cape. But we are making sure that we are becoming agents of creating regeneration. And I plant for abundance. I plant for butterflies, for bees, and all that stuff. And I don't use pesticides because it's not my what I'm here for. So one of the stories that I think is sort of in our culture is that humans are out there destroying stuff. And if you read the headlines, that seems to be the case. And that's really depressing stuff. And people who are depressed don't do anything. So Adam and I, we go out and scour around and we discover that that's actually a false story. There are tons of examples of people who are not only not destroying stuff, but actively using human intelligence to create more abundance faster than nature can alone, because we can be that clever if we want. So that's just one example, but we have examples across all sorts of different areas. I was relating one here from what we call living capital, which is building up the abundance of the natural world around you, even if you just have a suburban yard. And this can be done anywhere, right? In cities, this is a little harder to execute, but even there, you can make decisions about what you eat and how that food gets sourced, which will then either support these types of activities I just described or not. So again, there's lots of things people can do. We have lots of agency in this story, but it starts by understanding that we are not powerless and our actions matter. And that alignment between what you know and your personal actions feels really good and adds a lot to your quality of life, if not to your living standard over time.
Chris, what I find really fascinating about you guys and valuable about what you do is that, we're here at Gold Newsletter and at the New Orleans Investment Conference, we typically we're known as being kind of a gold bug event. And that's reflected somewhat in our speakers over the decades. And we focus on geopolitics, the economy, and everything else, but it gets down to us to a large extent in buying gold and getting ready for economic events. But you guys have come at it from an entirely different angle, and you bring up a lot of topics that and concerns that aren't typically addressed by our speakers and and our attendees, and you come at it from this different angle, but you come to largely the same conclusions. And that's what I find really refreshing and valuable and powerful about your message. I told the story the other day in your podcast that when I was at this real estate guys investment conference as a speaker earlier this year, and I'd never seen either one of you before, and you were featured speakers. And as I sat in the audience, you started speaking, and about 15, 20 minutes into your presentation, I got up and walked out the room, went to the bookstore and bought your book because I was convinced that by the time your speech ended, they would sell out of every last book. It was really powerful, really, as I say, compelling. And that's why I, immediately after your presentation, I asked if you could speak at this year's New Orleans Investment Conference, because I think you're going to bring something to this year's event that we've never seen before, and put similar concerns, similar issues, similar assumptions that we've had over the years in an entirely different light.
Well, thank you for that. And it really means a lot knowing, I'm sure you've been to one or two conferences in your day, so that we were able to speak in a way that you found fresh and compelling, and also angling back towards the same message, because that really is a core of our message. Is no matter which way we look at this thing, we rotate the cube and look at it kind of geopolitically, economically, monetarily, ecologically, through energy, and we come to the same conclusion, which is, wow, this thing is due for a big, big change. And like you, I think, we default to this idea that they, air quotes around that, they probably don't know what they're doing. And so we should all be, diversified, really diversified against what we would call bad decisions. And boy, we could spend all day, and I'm sure another 5 hours on this podcast if we had time, recounting all those bad decisions. But I trust that your listeners already know that. We don't need more convincing, but we do need to know, what do we do? And that's where I think Adam and I may have new ways to look at this that your people will find interesting, I hope.
Yeah, and Brian, this is Adam. One, I just want to say thank you. It's a huge compliment you paid us. But to what Chris said there, we went through, I think, a very similar journey individually that I think a lot of your listeners and a lot of your conference attendees have. And one of the very first steps we both took, even before Chris and I had met each other, was to load up on the precious metals for, I think, a lot of the same reasons your listeners have done as well. But probably like them, we found that there's a lot of information out there. We're not the only ones awake to these risks. And there's a lot of ink being spilled on the internet about the challenges we face. But at some point, you really want to move beyond problem definition and really get into solutions. What steps should I be taking about this? And yes, getting your financial house in order, positioning it defensively, putting your money into assets that can't be inflated away by bad monetary policy. Those are very important steps, but that's just a sliver of your life. Your financial portfolio is only a part of what the true wealth in your life is. Other parts of your wealth is your own health, your relationship to, your relationships to those in your family and the community in which you live, your emotional state, your homestead and where you live. Lots of people have lots of questions about what to do in those other areas of their lives as well. And I imagine most people listening to this probably have a lot of questions themselves. That's the additional territory that Chris and I really strive to explore in the rest of our work. We spend an awful lot of time charting where we are in the whole economic story, but Chris just talked about the ecological side of things. We talk a lot about the energetic side of things in terms of what's happening in the energy markets, because really without energy, nothing else happens. But we have a lot of material, both in books we've written and what we give in our presentations, and you've seen part of that, to help people begin to make sense of what are the other steps they should be considering in their lives besides just what they're doing with their money. And if we can help people make smart decisions there before some of these big corrections arrive, that's a fulfillment of our mission. And I
really cannot recommend your website more highly, peakprosperity.com, to our listeners, because it is it's a wealth of information on how you can improve your lifestyle regardless of what may happen, but in particular in preparation for the worst that may happen, and also analyzing the events from a number of areas. And Adam, you're correct in that I'm glad you brought it up, that you guys really do analyze the energy markets some important secular trends there that investors and people of all stripes really need to be aware of. So I hope our listeners will visit your website, because it is just a storehouse of wonderful information on improving your lifestyle and preparing for the culmination of a lot of these trends.
Yeah, the website is peakprosperity.com. And always go to goldnewsletter.com/podcast to hear the archives. Adam and Chris, thanks again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you in New Orleans in a few months.
Likewise, and thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you both. We're looking forward to meeting you guys in person.
Thanks, guys.